The sun was sinking, casting long, fading shadows over the empty road as Clara guided her truck carefully around each bend. She was drained, her muscles sore from a full day of working in the gardens, trimming hedges, and caring for blooms under the hot sun. Her fingers were stained with soil, and her clothes carried the earthy scent of freshly cut grass and damp soil. The quiet rhythm of her drive back home was comforting after a busy day, a moment she treasured to decompress, to watch the sun dip beneath the horizon, marking the end of another day of honest work. As the light dimmed, her headlights flickered on, illuminating the path ahead. It was a narrow, rural road, mostly abandoned at this hour. It cut through fields of wild grasses that swayed in the breeze, under an open sky painted with streaks of purple and pink from the setting sun. She allowed herself to relax, her mind drifting, when suddenly she spotted something unusual on the road ahead. First, she thought it might be an animal, a deer, perhaps, that had wandered onto the asphalt and been hit. But as she slowed down, squinting to get a better look, her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't an animal. A figure was sprawled across the road, just visible in the dim light of her headlights. A man. Motionless. Clara's breath caught, her mind racing through a series of questions. Who was this man? What had happened? Was he alive? Instinct kicked in, overriding her hesitation. She pulled over to the side of the road, her pulse racing. Gathering herself, she took a deep breath and approached him cautiously, her footsteps tentative as if she were approaching a sleeping giant who might awaken at any moment. The evening air was filled with an eerie silence, punctuated only by the faint hum of her truck engine idling nearby. As she got closer, the faint glow of her headlights revealed more details. His clothes, though wrinkled and disheveled, were clearly expensive. The fabric was too fine, too well-tailored to belong to someone from around these parts. His shirt, though smeared with dirt, looked like it could have cost more than her entire month's earnings. And his watch, she caught a glint of it on his wrist, a shiny, pristine piece that seemed starkly out of place here in the middle of nowhere. Clara kneeled beside him, her hands hovering over his body as she struggled to decide what to do. She could see faint traces of blood on his forehead, a fresh cut that seemed to explain his unconscious state. His breathing was shallow but steady. With each slight rise and fall of his chest, she felt her own heart beat slow. Reassured that at least he was alive, she leaned in closer, shaking his shoulder gently, calling out to him. "Hey, can you hear me?" she whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. He didn't respond, not even a flicker of an eyelash or a groan. Clara's stomach twisted with worry. Who was this man, and how had he ended up here, alone and vulnerable on an empty road? Her mind swirled with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Maybe he had been attacked and left for dead. Maybe he'd been in an accident and somehow crawled here, though she couldn't see any sign of another vehicle nearby. Or maybe he was running from something, from someone. A sense of urgency washed over her as she realized she couldn't just leave him here. He needed help fast. The hospital was a good 15-minute drive away, and even then, she wasn't sure she'd have cell reception to call ahead. Panic threatened to rise in her chest, but she pushed it down, her years of working alone in the gardens teaching her the importance of staying calm in unexpected situations. With a grunt of effort, she lifted him, surprised at how heavy he felt, his dead weight slumping awkwardly against her shoulder as she maneuvered him into her truck. The drive to the hospital was tense, filled with the hum of the engine and the muffled sound of her own rapid heartbeat. Every few seconds, she'd glance over at him, studying his face, the slight movement of his chest, the disheveled strands of hair that fell across his forehead. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about him, though she couldn't quite place it. His face was striking, chiseled in a way that hinted at a life of ease, of privilege. Whoever he was, he clearly wasn't an ordinary man. Halfway to the hospital, Clara's phone suddenly buzzed, startling her. She fumbled for it, glancing quickly at the screen. It was a message from her friend, letting her know they'd be waiting for her at home, but her attention was immediately pulled back to her passenger as he stirred. Just a slight shift, but enough to make her grip the wheel a little tighter, her eyes darting between the road and the mysterious man beside her. And then, as if in response to her silent question, his eyes fluttered open, piercing blue beneath heavy lids. He seemed dazed, his gaze unfocused, and for a moment she thought he might slip back into unconsciousness. But then he looked at her, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her catch her breath. Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but there was a quiet strength to it, a firmness that suggested he was used to being in control. "You're safe," Clara stammered, unsure of how much to say. "I found you on the road. You're hurt. I'm taking you to the hospital." He nodded weakly, his gaze drifting away as if he were lost in thought, piecing together the fragments of whatever had led him to that empty road. Clara wanted to ask him what had happened, who he was, but the words felt heavy on her tongue. She didn't want to pry, especially when he seemed barely coherent. Minutes passed in silence as the hospital came into view, its bright lights a beacon against the darkening sky. Clara exhaled, relief flooding her as she pulled into the parking lot, grateful they'd arrived safely. She was about to unbuckle her seatbelt and help him out when his hand shot out, gripping her arm with surprising strength. "Thank you," he murmured, his gaze locking onto hers once more. There was something almost desperate in his eyes, a hint of fear that made her pause. "Please, don't tell anyone you found me." "Not yet." The request hung heavy in the air as Clara struggled to process what he'd just said. Why wouldn't he want anyone to know? What was he hiding? The intensity in his eyes, the raw vulnerability that had briefly flickered across his face, told her that this was no ordinary request. She knew she should be cautious, but curiosity, strong and insistent, was beginning to take hold of her. She helped him out of the truck, supporting his weight as they made their way toward the hospital entrance. A strange feeling settled over her. She was beginning to realize that her life had just taken a turn, one she couldn't quite understand, but felt instinctively was irreversible. She didn't know it yet, but this encounter would set off a chain of events that would forever alter the course of her life, thrusting her into a world of secrets, power, and perhaps even danger that she had never dreamed existed. And as they entered the hospital, the last rays of sunlight disappearing behind them, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this mysterious man carried with him a story far more complicated than she was prepared for. Clara walked into the hospital with the man leaning heavily against her. She could feel her heartbeat pounding in her chest, each thud echoing in her ears. Every step was careful and deliberate. She could feel the weight of his body against her shoulder, and she adjusted her pace to keep him upright, sensing that his energy was quickly draining. The hospital lobby was quiet, with only a handful of patients and a receptionist looking up from her desk to see who had come in. The fluorescent lights made everything seem stark and surreal, casting a sharp clarity over each shadow, each small detail. Clara felt herself tense as the receptionist approached them, glancing with clear concern at the man by her side. "Is everything okay here?" the receptionist asked, looking him up and down, her eyes sharp and observant. "Yes, I found him on the road," Clara replied, keeping her voice steady even as her mind raced. "He's hurt and needs a doctor. Can we get some help?" The receptionist nodded, pressing a button and calling for assistance over the intercom. Moments later, 2 nurses arrived with a wheelchair, and Clara helped the man ease into it, his face pale and tired, though he still managed to offer a faint nod of gratitude in her direction. She watched as they wheeled him away, disappearing down the brightly lit corridor toward the emergency ward. Clara stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. She wanted to follow him, to make sure he was all right, to maybe get some answers. Yet, his earlier request lingered in her mind. "Please, don't tell anyone you found me." Not yet. She hadn't had time to ask what he meant or why he wanted such a strange favor, and now that he was out of sight, the curiosity gnawed at her even more intensely. Clara decided to stay, settling into one of the hard plastic chairs in the waiting area, feeling a mixture of apprehension and confusion. Her mind replayed the events of the past hour in a loop, searching for any clue, any sign of what might have led him to be alone and injured on that deserted road. His clothes, the unmistakable quality of the fabric, and the watch on his wrist, all those things marked him as someone important, someone accustomed to a life far removed from the rural landscape she called home. She couldn't shake the sense that he was hiding something, that the story of how he had ended up there was much more complicated than a simple accident. But what could possibly make a man of his apparent wealth and status end up unconscious and vulnerable in such a remote place? She didn't realize how much time had passed until a nurse approached her, breaking her from her thoughts. "Are you a family member?" the nurse asked gently, glancing over her clipboard with a faint frown. Clara hesitated, unsure how to respond. "No, I just found him. I wanted to make sure he was all right." The nurse gave her a sympathetic smile, but there was a hint of curiosity behind her professional demeanor. "He's stable," she replied. "A bit of a head injury, dehydration, and some exhaustion, but nothing life-threatening. We'll be keeping him overnight for observation." Clara let out a sigh of relief, her shoulders relaxing slightly. At least he was safe for now. "Thank you," she murmured, glancing down the hallway as if she could see him through the walls. "Is he awake?" The nurse shook her head. "Not at the moment. We gave him something to help him rest." Clara nodded, feeling both a sense of closure and an odd pang of disappointment. Part of her had hoped he'd be able to tell her something about himself, about what had happened to him. The nurse gave her one last look before returning to her duties, and Clara sat back down, torn between the urge to leave and the nagging curiosity that kept her glued to her seat. She couldn't ignore the sense of responsibility she felt. She had found him. She had brought him here. Somehow, it didn't feel right to just leave without knowing who he was, without understanding the story behind this strange encounter. As she sat there, her mind wandered to his eyes, the way they had looked at her in the truck, filled with something that went beyond simple gratitude. It was almost as if he'd been afraid of something or someone that she couldn't see. The memory of his quiet plea, the urgency in his voice, stirred a faint unease in her chest. Who was this man, and what was he hiding from? She had never met anyone like him before, someone who exuded an air of authority even in his weakened state. The more she thought about it, the stranger it all seemed. People in his position didn't just end up stranded on rural roads in the middle of the night. Something had happened to him, something serious enough to drive him to this remote area. Lost in her thoughts, Clara barely noticed the passing time until she felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. Startled, she looked up to see one of the nurses standing there, looking slightly hesitant. "Excuse me," the nurse said, lowering her voice. "The gentleman you brought in, he's awake now. He asked if you could come see him." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to wake up so soon, and she certainly hadn't expected him to ask for her. Nodding, she stood up and followed the nurse down the corridor, feeling a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. As they approached the room, the nurse gave her a reassuring smile before quietly stepping away, leaving her alone at the door. Taking a deep breath, Clara opened the door and stepped inside. The man was sitting up in bed, looking slightly more alert than before, though his face was still pale and there was a faint bandage on his forehead. His gaze met hers the moment she entered, and there was something intense in his eyes, a quiet gratitude mixed with something deeper, something she couldn't quite place. "Thank you," he said softly. His voice steady but laced with a tiredness that made it sound almost vulnerable. "I owe you my life." Clara shook her head, feeling her cheeks flush slightly. "You don't owe me anything," she replied, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "Anyone would have done the same." He gave a faint smile, but there was a hint of sadness in it, as if he knew her words weren't entirely true. "I'm not so sure about that," he murmured. "But you did help me, and for that, I'm grateful." They fell into a brief silence, each studying the other, both aware that there was so much left unsaid. Clara could feel the questions bubbling up inside her, but she didn't know where to start. Finally, he broke the silence, his gaze unwavering as he spoke. "I imagine you have questions." She nodded, unable to deny it. "I don't mean to pry," she said cautiously, "but how did you end up out there? And why didn't you want me to tell anyone I'd found you?" He looked away, his expression clouding as if he were wrestling with a decision. "It's complicated," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are things about my life, people, that I can't explain right now. But what I can say is that my presence here, it's dangerous, for me and possibly for anyone associated with me." Clara's brow furrowed, confusion mingling with a faint sense of fear. "Are you in trouble?" He hesitated, his gaze flickering back to her. "Yes and no. It's not that simple. Let's just say there are people who would go to great lengths to keep me from certain information." His voice trailed off as if he were weighing each word carefully, cautious not to reveal too much. The cryptic answer only deepened Clara's curiosity, but she sensed that pressing him would be futile. He had the look of someone who was accustomed to secrets, someone who had long ago learned the importance of discretion. Yet, there was a sincerity in his eyes that told her he wasn't lying. Even if he wasn't telling her everything, she nodded slowly, trying to process his words. "So, what happens now?" He exhaled, a faint tension easing from his shoulders. "I need to lay low for a while, at least until I'm sure it's safe. And for that, I could use your help." The request hung in the air between them, and Clara felt her heart rate quicken. She hadn't expected this turn of events, hadn't anticipated that her decision to help him would lead to something like this. Her mind raced with questions, doubts, fears, but beneath all of it, there was a strange sense of excitement, a feeling that this was more than just a chance encounter. "I don't know," she replied slowly, her voice filled with uncertainty. "I mean, I don't even know you. I don't even know your name." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, as if he had forgotten that she was still in the dark about who he really was. "My name is Alexander," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Alexander Hale." The name echoed in her mind, faintly familiar yet elusive, as if she had heard it somewhere but couldn't quite place it. "Alexander," she murmured, testing the name on her tongue. It felt strange, foreign, yet it somehow suited him. The name carried an air of importance, a weight that hinted at a life far removed from her own. He nodded, watching her closely as if gauging her reaction. "I understand if you're hesitant," he said, his tone gentle but resolute. "But I promise you, I wouldn't ask if it weren't important. You've already done so much for me, more than I could have expected from a stranger. But right now, I don't have anyone else I can trust." The vulnerability in his words struck a chord in Clara, stirring something within her that she couldn't quite explain. She didn't fully understand the situation, didn't know the dangers or the risks, but there was something about him that made her want to believe him, to trust him. After a long pause, she took a deep breath and nodded. "All right," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll help you." Clara could hardly believe the turn her life had taken in the past 24 hours. What had started as a quiet drive home on a deserted road had somehow transformed into a story that felt both surreal and unsteady. She didn't even know if she could fully trust Alexander, let alone comprehend why he would need her help to lay low, or why she was even willing to go along with such a strange request. Yet, something about the look in his eyes, the way he had held her gaze with that quiet desperation, had pulled her in. There was an air of mystery surrounding him that felt impossible to ignore, and her curiosity had gotten the better of her. The following morning, Clara was back at the hospital, waiting anxiously in the lobby. The sterile, impersonal surroundings made her feel both out of place and strangely grounded. It was as though the walls and bright fluorescent lights had become a stark dividing line between the life she'd known up until now and the strange, uncertain path that seemed to be unfolding before her. Alexander had requested she come back today, though he hadn't been clear on what he had planned. All she knew was that he wanted her to pick him up and help him get to somewhere safe, whatever that meant. Clara had spent the entire night trying to make sense of it all, wondering if she was making a mistake. If she should have called someone else instead of getting herself involved with a man whose life was clearly entangled in complications she couldn't begin to understand. But here she was, waiting for him as if she had no other choice, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over her. When Alexander finally emerged from his room, she was taken aback by the difference in his appearance. The weariness still lingered in his eyes, but he had a determined look on his face, his shoulders set with a purpose that hadn't been there the night before. He was dressed in a plain white shirt and a pair of jeans that looked as though they'd been brought to him by someone at the hospital, far less formal than the clothes he'd worn when she'd found him, but there was an unmistakable elegance to his posture, a quiet dignity that remained unbroken by his current circumstances. Clara felt an odd pang in her chest as she looked at him. He seemed so out of place in the modest hospital corridor, a figure of unmistakable importance thrust into an environment that felt beneath him. He approached her with a small, almost shy smile, and for a moment, she caught a glimpse of vulnerability beneath the layers of mystery he wore like armor. "Clara," he said softly, his voice warm but weary. "Thank you for coming back. I wasn't sure if you would." She shrugged, trying to keep her voice steady. "You asked me to help you, and I'm here." Her words felt clumsy, inadequate, but he nodded, understanding more in her simple answer than she'd intended. As they stepped out into the parking lot, Clara felt the tension in the air shift. Here, away from the cold sterility of the hospital, Alexander seemed almost lighter, as if he'd left some of his troubles behind with the hospital walls. She led him to her truck, the old vehicle looking almost comically humble next to him. For a split second, she wondered what he must think of her simple life, her modest possessions, but he didn't say a word. He simply climbed in, closing the door quietly as though he didn't want to disturb the delicate silence that hung between them. Clara started the engine, the familiar rumble grounding her, reminding her that she was still herself, even in the presence of this enigmatic stranger. As they drove, she glanced at him from the corner of her eye, noting the way his fingers tapped rhythmically against his knee, a nervous habit that betrayed his calm facade. She wanted to ask him more, to dig deeper, to understand what had led him to that road in the middle of nowhere, but she held back, afraid that any prying would shatter the fragile trust that had formed between them. Eventually, he broke the silence himself, his voice soft and reflective. "It must seem strange, me asking for your help like this. I know I haven't told you much, and I apologize for that. But I hope you can understand, I didn't have anyone else I could trust." Clara nodded, keeping her eyes on the road. "You don't have to explain," she replied quietly, though the curiosity gnawed at her. She wanted to know, needed to know. But she sensed that whatever he was hiding, it was something heavy, something that couldn't be shared lightly. They drove in silence for a while longer until they reached the edge of town. Alexander directed her down a winding road that led to a secluded area, far from any of the bustling neighborhoods or crowded streets. It was a small, isolated house, hidden among tall trees and overgrown foliage that seemed to create a natural barrier, protecting it from the outside world. Clara's heart raced as she pulled up to the house, wondering what kind of place this was, why he had chosen it, and if he'd been here before. But Alexander's expression remained calm, his gaze focused on the house with a look of quiet familiarity, as though it held memories only he could access. He glanced over at her, offering a reassuring smile that only partially eased her anxiety. "This is a safe place," he explained. "At least, for now." Clara followed him as he led her up the narrow path to the front door. The house was simple and unassuming, with a faded blue exterior and a creaky wooden porch that groaned under their footsteps. Inside, it was sparse but tidy. The furniture was modest, the walls bare, and the air held a faint, musty scent that suggested it hadn't been lived in for some time. Yet there was a warmth to it, a sense of quiet sanctuary that made her feel oddly at ease, despite the strange circumstances. A.S. Alexander settled into one of the worn armchairs. Clara couldn't hold back her questions any longer. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Alexander," she began, her voice steady but curious. "I know you have your reasons for keeping things vague, and I respect that. But if I'm going to help you, I need to understand what's going on. Why did you end up on that road? And who are you hiding from?" He looked down, his fingers tracing the fraying edges of the armchair, as though he were drawing strength from the worn fabric. For a long moment, he didn't respond, and Clara wondered if she'd overstepped, if she'd asked too much too soon. But then, he lifted his gaze, meeting her eyes with a quiet intensity that took her breath away. "My family," he said softly, the words laced with a bitterness that surprised her. "My life, it's not as simple as it might seem. My family is complicated." He paused, struggling to find the right words, his face darkening with a mixture of anger and regret. "They're powerful, wealthy, influential, and for a long time, I was a part of that world, a willing participant in the life they'd created." But his voice trailed off, a shadow passing over his face as he hesitated. "I learned something, a secret, something I wasn't supposed to know. And when I tried to walk away, to leave that life behind, they didn't take it well." Clara's pulse quickened as she absorbed his words, each revelation sharpening the image of the life he'd left behind. She could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of whatever knowledge he carried, and it was clear that this wasn't just a simple family disagreement. Whatever he had discovered, it was powerful enough to have driven him to the point of abandoning his old life, to seek refuge in anonymity and isolation. She couldn't imagine the kind of courage or desperation it must have taken to leave everything behind, to sever ties with a family that wielded such power. She wanted to ask him more, to dig deeper into the details of his story, but she sensed that pushing him too hard might drive him further into himself. Instead, she reached out, resting a hand on his arm, offering silent support. He looked at her, his gaze softening, as though he were grateful for her quiet understanding. "They won't stop looking for me," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not until they're sure I'm no longer a threat." A chill ran down Clara's spine at the implication of his words. This wasn't just about family loyalty or hurt feelings. This was a matter of life and death. Whatever knowledge he possessed, it was valuable enough to warrant extreme measures. She could see it in his eyes, the haunted look that betrayed the fear he tried so hard to hide. He was a man on the run, a fugitive from a life of wealth and privilege, hunted by the very people who had once been his closest allies. The gravity of the situation settled over her, filling the quiet room with a sense of foreboding. She realized, perhaps for the first time, the full extent of the danger they both faced. By choosing to help him, she had unwittingly become a part of his world, entangled in the web of secrets and threats that surrounded him. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was no turning back, that her life had been irreversibly altered by this chance encounter. Alexander seemed to sense her unease, and he reached out, his hand covering hers in a gesture of reassurance. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet regret. "I didn't mean to drag you into this. I never wanted anyone else to be involved. But you saved me, and for that, I can never thank you enough." Clara shook her head, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her. "You don't have to thank me," she replied. "You needed help, and I couldn't just leave you there. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." He looked at her, a mixture of gratitude and relief softening his features, and for a moment, the weight of his past seemed to lift, leaving him vulnerable and unguarded. Clara felt a surge of protectiveness, a fierce determination to help him, no matter the cost. She didn't fully understand why she felt this way, why she was willing to risk so much for a man she barely knew. But in that moment, none of it mattered. All she knew was that she couldn't turn back, not now. Clara was still adjusting to the unusual routine her life had fallen into. The quiet life she had once known, marked by long days in her garden and peaceful evenings in her little cottage, now felt like a distant memory. Each morning brought new uncertainties, new challenges, and a heightened awareness of the dangers that loomed in the background. She found herself looking over her shoulder more often, her senses sharpened by the knowledge that Alexander's past might catch up to them at any moment. And yet, despite the constant undercurrent of fear, she felt a strange sense of purpose that she had never felt before. There was a weight to her days now, a sense of significance that had been absent from her life before Alexander had entered it. Their days together in the isolated house had settled into a careful rhythm. Alexander kept mostly to himself, spending hours studying documents that Clara wasn't privy to, his face tense and focused as he pored over each page. She could tell he was preparing for something, though he never shared the specifics. At night, they would sit in the small living room, sometimes in companionable silence, other times in quiet conversation that often skirted around the truth of his past. He would share small details about his life, anecdotes about his travels or memories of his childhood, but the deeper secrets remained locked away, held close to his chest. Clara respected his silence, understanding that whatever he was hiding was painful, that speaking of it would somehow solidify the reality of his situation in a way he wasn't ready to face. One evening, as they sat by the dim glow of the single lamp in the living room, Clara found herself studying him, noticing the tension in his jaw, the way his gaze seemed distant, focused on something she couldn't see. She wondered what was going through his mind, what memories haunted him when he thought she wasn't looking. She had come to care for him deeply, a connection she hadn't anticipated and wasn't entirely sure how to navigate. There was a depth to him that fascinated her, a quiet strength that both comforted and intrigued her. He was like no one she had ever met, a man marked by his past yet driven by a sense of purpose that resonated with something deep within her. She wanted to ask him what he was planning, why he spent so much time with those documents, but she held back, sensing that the timing wasn't right. Instead, she offered him a warm smile, hoping to ease the tension she sensed in him. "You know," she said softly, her voice breaking the comfortable silence between them, "you don't have to keep everything bottled up. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." Alexander looked at her, his gaze softening, a flicker of gratitude passing over his face. He seemed to weigh her words, his expression shifting as he considered whether or not to share more with her. Finally, he sighed, leaning back in his chair, his shoulders relaxing slightly as though a burden had been lifted, if only for a moment. "It's just complicated," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are things I wish I could tell you, things I want to share with you. But if I did, if you knew everything, I don't think you'd look at me the same way." Clara felt her heart clench at his words, the vulnerability in his voice tugging at something deep within her. She reached out, resting her hand on his, offering him silent reassurance. "Whatever it is, I'm here," she said gently. "You don't have to go through this alone." He looked down at her hand, his fingers brushing against hers, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you, Clara," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet sincerity that made her heart ache. "You don't know how much that means to me." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air between them. She could feel the tension in his hand, the unyielding strength that masked a deep, hidden pain. She wanted to ease that pain, to offer him some measure of comfort, but she knew that whatever he was facing, he would have to confront it on his own terms. She couldn't force him to open up, couldn't demand answers to questions he wasn't ready to face. As the days passed, Clara began to notice subtle changes in his behavior. He became more guarded, more cautious, as though he sensed a looming threat that she couldn't perceive. He would glance out the window frequently, his gaze scanning the tree line, his body tense with a vigilance that reminded her of a hunted animal. She could see the toll it was taking on him, the way his shoulders would slump at the end of the day, the exhaustion etched into his face. And yet, he never complained, never voiced the fears she knew haunted him. He bore his burden in silence, a quiet strength that both humbled and saddened her. One evening, as they were preparing dinner, Alexander suddenly tensed, his gaze snapping to the window. Clara followed his line of sight, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the shadows of the trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. But Alexander's expression was tense, his body coiled like a spring, ready to leap into action at a moment's notice. She could see the fear in his eyes, a primal, instinctive terror that sent a chill down her spine. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He shook his head, his gaze never leaving the window. "I don't know," he murmured, his voice laced with unease. "But something feels off." Clara's heart raced as she watched him, her own fear bubbling to the surface. She had trusted him, had believed in his need for secrecy, but now she realized just how little she truly understood about the dangers that surrounded him. She had been so focused on the mystery of his past that she hadn't fully grasped the reality of the present, the very real threats that lurked in the shadows. They stood in silence, their gazes fixed on the darkening landscape outside, the tension between them almost palpable. She wanted to ask him if he was sure, if there was really something to be afraid of, but the look in his eyes told her all she needed to know. This wasn't paranoia or fear of the unknown. This was the reaction of a man who knew danger intimately, who had faced threats that few could comprehend. Eventually, the tension seemed to ease, and Alexander let out a quiet sigh, his shoulders relaxing as he turned back to her. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet apology. "I didn't mean to scare you." Clara shook her head, offering him a reassuring smile. "It's all right," she replied gently. "I trust you. If you say there's something to be worried about, I believe you." He looked at her, his gaze filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something deeper and more profound. For a moment, she felt as though he was about to say something, to share some long-buried truth, but he held back, his words swallowed by the silence that stretched between them. The days continued in this delicate balance, a dance of trust and caution that left Clara both exhilarated and exhausted. She found herself growing more protective of Alexander, watching over him with a fierce determination that surprised even herself. She hadn't expected to feel so deeply, to care so much for someone she had known for such a short time. But there was something about him that resonated with her, a quiet strength that drew her in, making her want to protect him, to shield him from the world that seemed so intent on tearing him down. One night, as they sat by the fire, Alexander turned to her, his gaze filled with a quiet intensity that took her breath away. "Clara," he began, his voice soft but unwavering. "I know I haven't been entirely honest with you. There are things about my past that I've kept hidden, things I thought would protect you. But I can see now that keeping you in the dark isn't fair. You deserve to know the truth." Her heart raced at his words, a mixture of fear and anticipation flooding her senses. She had waited so long to hear him say this, to finally open up to her, and now that the moment had come, she felt a surge of conflicting emotions. She wanted to know, needed to understand the shadows that haunted him, but a part of her feared what she might discover, feared the darkness that lay hidden beneath the surface. Alexander took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving hers. "My family, they're powerful, influential in ways that few can understand. They control things, behind the scenes, in a way that most people would never suspect. And for a long time, I was a part of that world, a willing participant in the life they'd built. But as I grew older, I began to see things, to understand the lengths they would go to in order to maintain their control. And when I tried to leave, when I tried to escape, I became a threat to them." Clara listened in silence, her heart pounding as she absorbed his words. She could hear the pain in his voice, the bitterness that laced each syllable, and she knew that whatever he had gone through, it had left scars that ran deep. He had been forced to make choices that few could comprehend, choices that had led him to this isolated house, to a life of hiding and secrecy. "They want me silenced," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "They can't afford to let me live, not when I know what I know. And so, they've sent people after me, people who won't stop until they've finished the job." Clara's breath caught in her throat at his words, the full weight of his confession settling over her like a shroud. This wasn't just a family feud or a disagreement over money. This was a life-or-death struggle, a fight for survival against forces she couldn't begin to understand. She reached out, her hand finding his, offering him silent support. "I'm here," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "I won't let them hurt you. We'll face this together." He looked at her, his gaze filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something that spoke of a bond forged in the fires of shared adversity. She could see the relief in his eyes, the way her words seemed to lift a weight from his shoulders, and she knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. In that moment, she felt a surge of strength, a fierce protectiveness that she hadn't known she possessed. She was no longer the quiet gardener who had stumbled upon a stranger in need. She was a warrior, standing beside him, ready to fight for the man she had come to care for more deeply than she could have ever imagined. The wind howled against the windows, rattling them like they were barely able to keep out the elements, a reminder of the isolation that surrounded them. The once comforting sounds of nature now seemed ominous, as though the very world outside had turned against them. Clara stood in the dim light of the kitchen, watching Alexander from across the room, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, the knowledge that they were truly alone in this fight, that there was no one coming to help them. The reality of their situation was sinking in, each passing moment bringing with it a new layer of dread. Alexander sat at the small table, his head bowed, his hands clenched into fists on the worn surface. He looked exhausted, defeated, as though the weight of his past had finally caught up with him. Clara wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but she knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to ease the pain he was carrying. She had come to understand that his silence was his way of protecting himself, of shielding her from the darkness that surrounded him. But now, as she watched him, she realized that there was no escaping it. They were in this together, for better or worse. The silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive, until finally, Alexander spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're getting closer," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the table. "I can feel it. It's only a matter of time before they find us." Clara's heart raced at his words, a cold fear settling in her stomach. She had known this day would come, had prepared herself for the moment when their temporary haven would no longer be safe. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real, brought the danger crashing down around her like a tidal wave. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm, to think clearly. They had come too far to give up now, had faced too many obstacles to let fear paralyze them. "We'll find a way out of this," she said softly, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her. "We'll get through this together." Alexander looked up at her, his gaze filled with a mixture of gratitude and despair. "I don't want you to be a part of this, Clara," he murmured, his voice laced with pain. "You don't deserve to be dragged into my mess. You should be somewhere safe, somewhere far away from all of this." Clara shook her head, her resolve hardening. "I chose to be here, Alexander. I chose to stay by your side. I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. Clara could see the conflict in his eyes, the desire to protect her battling with the realization that she was already too deeply involved to walk away. She could feel his fear, his guilt, and yet beneath it all, there was something else, something that bound them together in a way that words couldn't express. They spent the rest of the evening in tense silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The weight of what was to come pressing down on them like a storm cloud hanging low over the horizon. Clara could feel the tension building, the anticipation of what lay ahead creating an almost palpable energy in the air. She knew that they were on the edge of something, that the peace they had found was fragile, a delicate thread that could snap at any moment. As night fell, they made their way to the small living room, where the only light came from the flickering flames in the fireplace. The soft glow cast shadows across the room, creating an atmosphere of warmth and comfort that belied the fear that lingered just beneath the surface. They sat in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts, the crackling of the fire the only sound breaking the stillness. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice barely audible. "I can't keep running forever," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the flames. "At some point, I'll have to face them. I'll have to put an end to this, one way or another." Clara's heart clenched at his words, a mixture of fear and admiration flooding her senses. She could hear the resolve in his voice, the determination that had carried him through so many trials, and yet she could also sense the weariness that had taken hold of him, the exhaustion that came from a life spent in constant fear. She reached out, her hand finding his, offering him silent support. "You're not alone," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." He looked at her, a flicker of something she couldn't quite identify passing over his face. For a moment, she thought he might argue, might try to push her away once again. But instead, he simply nodded, his hand tightening around hers, a silent acceptance of her presence in his life. They sat like that for what felt like hours, the fire slowly dying down, the room growing colder as the night wore on. Clara could feel the weight of sleep tugging at her body exhausted from the tension and fear that had filled the day. But just as she was beginning to drift off, a sound shattered the silence, a faint rustling coming from outside the window. Her eyes snapped open, her heart pounding as she listened, straining to hear any sign of movement. Alexander was already alert, his body tensed, his gaze fixed on the window. The rustling grew louder, a steady, ominous sound that sent a chill down her spine. She could feel her pulse quicken, her body flooded with adrenaline as the realization hit her. They were no longer alone. Alexander moved quickly, his movements smooth and silent as he made his way to the window, his gaze scanning the darkness outside. Clara followed, her heart racing as she peered out into the night, her eyes searching for any sign of movement. She could feel the fear creeping up her spine, a primal, instinctive terror that told her they were in grave danger. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the darkness pressing in around them like a living entity, heavy and oppressive. But then, just as she was beginning to think that they might be safe, a shadow shifted in the distance, a faint movement that sent a jolt of fear through her body. "They found us," Alexander whispered, his voice filled with a quiet, resigned dread that Clara's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing as she tried to process his words. The reality of the situation crashed over her like a wave, the knowledge that their sanctuary had been compromised, that they were no longer safe. She felt a surge of panic, a desperate urge to flee, to run as far as she could from the danger that loomed in the darkness. But even as the fear threatened to consume her, she forced herself to stay calm, to think clearly. She had chosen this path, had made the decision to stand by Alexander's side, and now, in the face of imminent danger, she knew that she couldn't abandon him. She had come too far, had sacrificed too much to turn back now. "We need to leave," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the fear she could see in his eyes. "They won't stop until they've found us. We can't stay here." Clara nodded, her mind racing as she considered their options. The house had become their refuge, a place of safety in a world filled with danger. But now it had become a trap, a prison from which they had to escape before it was too late. She could feel the urgency in Alexander's voice, the desperation that mirrored her own fear, and she knew that they didn't have much time. They moved quickly, gathering only the essentials, their movements silent and efficient as they prepared to leave. Clara could feel her heart pounding, her body flooded with adrenaline as the reality of their situation sank in. They were running, once again, fleeing from a threat that loomed just beyond the edge of the darkness, an unseen enemy that hunted them with relentless determination. As they slipped out into the night, Clara felt a surge of fear, a cold, creeping dread that gnawed at her insides. The world around them was dark and silent, the shadows stretching out like grasping hands, eager to pull them back into the danger they were trying to escape. She could feel the weight of Alexander's hand in hers, a steady presence that anchored her, that reminded her she wasn't alone. They moved through the darkness, their footsteps barely making a sound as they slipped through the trees, the dense forest surrounding them like a shroud. Clara could feel her heart racing, her senses heightened by the fear that coursed through her veins. Every sound, every shadow seemed to hold a threat, a danger that lurked just out of sight, waiting to strike. For hours, they walked in silence, their movements careful and deliberate as they made their way through the forest. Clara could feel the exhaustion creeping in, her body protesting the relentless pace they had set, but she forced herself to keep going, to push through the fatigue that threatened to overwhelm her. She knew that stopping wasn't an option, that their only hope lay in putting as much distance as possible between them and the danger that pursued them. Finally, as dawn began to break, they reached a small clearing, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the trees, casting a soft, golden glow over the landscape. Clara collapsed onto the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion, her lungs burning from the effort of their flight. She could feel the tension slowly easing, the fear that had gripped her beginning to dissipate in the warm light of morning. Alexander knelt beside her, his gaze filled with a mixture of relief and concern. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his voice filled with a quiet, genuine worry that made her heart ache. Clara nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she forced a weak smile. "I'll be fine," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "We're safe now, aren't we?" Alexander's expression grew serious, his gaze shifting to the horizon as he scanned the surrounding forest. "For now," he replied, his voice laced with a quiet resolve. "But they won't stop. They'll keep coming, no matter where we go." Clara's heart sank at his words, the reality of their situation settling over her like a shroud. She had known that their journey would be difficult, had understood the risks involved in standing by Alexander's side. But now, as she sat in the cold light of dawn, the weight of their predicament became all too real. They were fugitives, hunted and pursued by an enemy that would stop at nothing to destroy them. Their only hope lay in staying one step ahead, in outsmarting the forces that sought to tear them apart. It was a dangerous game, a deadly dance that demanded every ounce of strength, every shred of courage they possessed. And yet, as Clara looked at Alexander, saw the determination in his eyes, the unwavering resolve that had carried him through so many trials, she felt a surge of strength, a fierce determination that burned brighter than the fear that threatened to consume her. She had chosen this path, had made the decision to stand by his side, and she knew that no matter what lay ahead, she would see it through to the end. For better or worse, they were bound together, two souls united by fate, drawn together by a shared purpose that transcended the fear, the danger, the uncertainty that surrounded them. And as they sat together in the quiet of the clearing, the first rays of dawn illuminating their faces, Clara knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, side by side, for as long as it took.